On an April morning in 2012, newlyweds Nikki and Danny Miller sat on the floor of their living room playing with their 6-month-old son, Carson. Carson lay on his back on the rug, smiling his toothless smile, his chubby little legs kicking in the air. Nikki had a stuffed animal that she kept lowering over Carson's face, then pulling it back when he reached for it. The boy went into a fit of giggles every time, and Danny's heart swelled with love as he watched. Danny was 42 and Nikki was 40, so when they got married last year, they weren't even sure they could have kids. To Danny, Carson was a little miracle, with his soft blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Danny never took a single second for granted, even though his energetic baby really wore him out. Danny leaned over Carson and made silly faces until the baby turned red from laughter. Then Nikki waved the stuffed animal again, and their baby swiped at it, but Carson's arm was stiff and awkward. Danny had noticed over the past few weeks that Carson's movements were somewhat awkward. At first, Danny had assumed it was just his son getting used to his own body. It was sort of cute. But over the last couple of days, Danny had noticed something else that was unusual about Carson's coordination. It took a lot of work for his son to roll over onto his stomach. Danny and Nikki had been reading a ton of baby books, so they knew that by month 6, he should be able to roll onto his stomach, then onto his back again. But even when Danny or Nikki helped, their son still struggled to roll. Danny knew that as a first-time parent, he could sometimes be alarmist, so he tried his best not to fixate on his son's delayed motor skills. But, just to be safe, he decided to schedule an appointment with his son's pediatrician. When they saw that pediatrician, he'd recommended they speak with someone else, a specialist, who might be better equipped to give them answers. A week later, Danny sat beside Nikki in a doctor's office, watching the behavioral specialist examine their son. The specialist was kind and had a calming demeanor, and he listened intently while Danny explained their concerns about Carson. And he never made Danny feel like he was an over-anxious new parent. Eventually, the specialist's examination of Carson turned into a little game of peekaboo, and once Carson was giggling, the specialist turned to Nikki and Danny and said that he was not too concerned. He reassured them that babies develop at different rates, and it seemed like Carson was just taking his sweet time. Danny nodded and squeezed his wife's shoulder as she exhaled with relief. Danny wished he felt the same way, but he didn't. Instead, he was left with this nagging feeling that there might be something more to Carson's problems than just him taking his sweet time. That night, as Nikki put Carson to bed, Danny began poking around on the internet, researching developmental delays in children. He learned about a disruption in muscle movement called spasticity, which seemed to describe the jerky way that Carson moved his arms. Danny also read about a condition called hypotonia that could account for Carson's lack of muscle tone. He wondered if that was why Carson still couldn't roll over on his own. And yet, Danny didn't really know what to do with this information. They'd seen a specialist who presumably would have known all about these conditions in babies, and he didn't seem concerned. So Danny closed his laptop, deciding he would just be patient. Carson was only 6 months old, and Danny told himself that Carson would just grow into his body over the next few months. 9 months later, in early 2013, Danny sat on the floor with Nikki, their backs against the living room sofa. Wooden blocks and storybooks were strewn all around them. Nikki's hands were resting on her very pregnant stomach. They were both very excited to be having a second child. Carson, who was now almost 16 months old, was sitting in Danny's lap as Danny flipped through a pack of animal flashcards. He encouraged Carson to say the names of each animal, or to at least make the animal noises. But while Carson reached out a shaky hand to pet the animal cards, he didn't say any of their names or imitate the sounds they made. Carson still wasn't talking, which was highly unusual for a kid his age. And Carson had other developmental delays too. He couldn't sit upright on his own or crawl either. Eager to find something his child could do well, Danny put the flashcards away and reached for the wooden block set. Maybe Carson was more of a builder. Danny sat his son next to the blocks, and right away, Carson grabbed a blue square in his tiny fist. Carson started moving the block to add it to the little pyramid his dad was building, but then Carson's hand shook uncontrollably and he dropped it. Danny jumped up and scooped Carson into his arms. He was quite accustomed to Carson's poor motor skills, but he'd never seen his son's hand tremble like that before. He held Carson, waiting to see if he could feel any more shaking, but Carson seemed okay. Danny gave Nikki a wary look and told her maybe it was time to take Carson back to the doctor, and Nikki nodded and said she was thinking the same thing. A few days later, Carson's pediatrician ordered an MRI to see if there was a physical problem that would explain Carson's developmental delays. But when the MRI came back, it was normal. That's when Danny told the pediatrician about the alarming conditions he had found online. He talked about spasticity and hypotonia and a few other rabbit holes he'd fallen into. And to Danny's surprise, the pediatrician thought he might actually be onto something and referred them back to that specialist. Now, Danny and Nikki sat in the behavioral specialist's office for the second time as he looked over Carson's file and ran some of the same little tests that he'd used to examine Carson's motor skills the first time. But this time, the specialist agreed with Danny and Nikki. Carson's development was definitely falling behind, and the doctor believed that the little boy might have a condition that would account for some of these developmental delays. In his opinion, Carson's delays were due to cerebral palsy, which is a group of conditions that affect movement and posture, sometimes severely. It's caused by damage to or abnormal development of the brain. Danny nodded and squeezed his wife's hand. He'd come across cerebral palsy several times when he was Googling Carson's symptoms, so Danny had known that this diagnosis could be a possibility. But it was still hard to hear it aloud. Cerebral palsy is not curable, which meant that Carson would never grow out of his developmental delays. Carson would have a lifelong disability. The specialist assured Danny and Nikki that therapy could help Carson manage the cerebral palsy and suggested that they begin physical and occupational therapy right away. Together, these therapies would help with his motor skills and cognitive development. Danny began calling therapists the next day, trying to find the perfect fit for Carson. However, he had to put the search on hold for a week when Nikki went into labor. And in mid-January 2013, Carson's little brother, Chase, was born. Nearly a year later, toward the end of 2013, Danny pushed Carson in a stroller up a steep hill in San Francisco, where he and Nikki were vacationing. Danny's legs were burning, but Carson was enjoying the feel of the steep incline so much that Danny forced himself to keep on moving. Besides, he was following Nikki, who trudged ahead, carrying little Chase in a sling. And if she wasn't complaining, neither would he. At this point, Chase was 10 months old, and Carson was almost 3. And neither boy could walk yet. Now, this made sense for Chase, who was still a bit young to be on his feet. But for Carson, it was definitely concerning. And they had to push him in a stroller whenever they went anywhere, which made carting him up and down the steep hills of San Francisco extremely tiring. Intellectually, Carson seemed to be just fine. He was curious, always looking around and giggling, trying to grab at things that sparked his curiosity. But even after a year of therapy, he still couldn't sit upright on his own very well, let alone crawl or walk. His little brother Chase also struggled to sit upright, which worried Danny. He'd been noticing that Chase was experiencing a lot of the same developmental delays that Carson struggled with. But Danny tried not to focus on that today. They'd spent the morning at Golden Gate Park, then they had taken a trolley ride through town. Danny had loved the way the boys laughed themselves silly on the trolley as it coasted down some of the steeper hills. And so now, after lunch, Danny and Nikki were taking the boys to another park to play. They walked through the gates of a playground and set Carson and Chase into a big red sandbox. Nikki sat behind Carson, helping him sit upright, while Danny handed Chase a little plastic shovel. Chase reached out with a jerky arm and grabbed the shovel, but just as his fingers wrapped around it, his hand shook. He lost his grip and dropped it. Danny realized that Chase had a tremor in his hand, just like his older brother Carson. Danny's mind started racing. He wondered if Chase might have cerebral palsy too. Except that didn't make any sense. Danny had read once that statistically, the odds of siblings each having cerebral palsy were 1 in a million. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Chase was developing these same delays as his older brother. Danny thought hard for a second. If both his boys had the same condition, then again, based on statistics, they probably did not have cerebral palsy, which meant that Carson may have been misdiagnosed. And if that was the case, well, Danny and Nikki were back at square one, only worse. Now they were searching for a diagnosis for both of their children. Two years later, in late 2015, Danny and Nikki still felt like they didn't actually know what was wrong with their sons. Over the past 2 years, they had brought Carson and Chase to specialist after specialist, and most of them agreed that whatever the boys had, it was not cerebral palsy. It was likely genetic. But none of the specialists had been able to pinpoint what exactly was causing the boys' symptoms. Carson and Chase had been tested for a staggering array of diseases. Rare metabolic disorders like phenylketonuria and Tay-Sachs, which damage the body's ability to process nutrients and enzymes. They had been tested for abnormalities in their chromosomes, as well as genetic disorders like Fragile X syndrome and degenerative disorders like Friedreich's ataxia that attacks the nervous system. So far, the boys tested negative for all of them. But that only encouraged Danny to spend more time researching on his own, looking for some kind of answer. Danny and Nikki had even discussed whether or not it was maybe something they'd done. Like, had Nikki taken the right prenatal vitamins? Or had they unknowingly exposed the boys to some kind of environmental toxin or something? They didn't know, but Danny hated the idea that they were now blaming themselves for their boy's mysterious condition. Danny knew they could not keep living like this. He had to find answers soon. A few months later, Danny was at home playing with his boys. Chase was now 2 years old, and Carson was 4. Both boys had grown into happy kids with matching blue eyes and pale yellow hair. Carson had grown out of his baby fat and looked like a handsome little boy. He still couldn't walk, but he could sit up by himself and had recently started crawling. This morning, Danny put both boys on the carpet in the living room. Then he dangled a Christmas ornament in front of Carson, who was sitting upright, watching the ornament catch the sunlight and sparkle. Danny hoped Carson would reach out and grab the ornament. This was something he had been working on in physical therapy. But today, the boy just reached clumsily toward the little figurine, touching it with his palm, but seemingly unable to close his hand around it. Eventually, when he continued not being able to grab the ornament, Carson started to get visibly upset, until Danny finally set the ornament in his lap and told his son it was a good try. But Danny was worried. Only a week earlier, Carson could actually grab hold of an object, but now he couldn't. It was like he was going backward. That afternoon, Danny called the boy's pediatrician to try to make an appointment. And that's when the pediatrician suggested that it was time to do a specialized type of testing called gene sequencing. It can detect missing or broken base pairs among the billions of pieces of the boy's DNA. The doctor thought they should do this as soon as possible. Gene sequencing is an involved procedure, and it can take 2 or 3 months to get the test results back. Danny sighed at the doctor's recommendation. It felt like he spent his entire life waiting around for test results that always disappointed. After all this time, they still didn't know what was wrong with Carson and Chase, making it impossible to treat the boys or even know their limitations. Danny worried that his son's quality of life suffered because the doctors could not figure out what condition they actually had. Still, Danny agreed to do the genetic sequencing and hid his frustration from the doctor. And when he hung up the phone, Danny grabbed his computer and took up his usual place on the couch, diving back into his own research. Early in 2016, Danny had just gotten home from work when the phone rang. It was the specialist who'd conducted Chase and Carson's genetic sequencing. Danny held his breath. They'd been waiting for these results for 3 very stressful months. During that time, both boys continued to go downhill. Chase stopped crawling, something he'd actually begun to get fairly good at, and Carson still was not walking. By this point, he should not only have been walking, but maybe even running. He should also have been in preschool by this point, making friends with kids his own age. Instead, he was stranded on the living room floor, unable to carry himself from room to room. But the specialist's call did not give Danny any relief. Danny was told that the long-awaited sequencing results didn't show any genetic damage that would explain his son's symptoms. On paper, at least, the boys seemed genetically perfect. Danny felt hopeless. He asked the doctor, what is he and his wife supposed to do now? The doctor advised Danny that the best thing he could do was just check back in a year. They might have better testing by then, and maybe then they could find some answers. Then they hung up, leaving Danny wanting to scream in frustration. It was beginning to feel like Carson and Chase were the only two people on the planet with this mysterious condition. The next day was a Saturday. Danny wanted to spend an easy morning with his family, but he knew he had a mission. Right after breakfast, he moved his laptop to the living room and spent the entire day combing through articles and medical journals. 10 hours later, at the bottom of one of his research papers, he saw something. A mention of a group called the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. Curious, Danny followed the ad to the network's homepage. The UDN was run by the National Institutes of Health, and its goal was to provide answers to patients affected by mysterious medical conditions. UDN promised to take on the most challenging medical cases, like a last resort for families with nowhere else to go. To Danny, that sounded exactly like his family's situation. He called to his wife and then brought his laptop into the kitchen to tell her what he'd found. She immediately asked, would they take the boy's case? Danny said there was only one way to find out, and he opened up an application to the program. Almost a year later, in January of 2017, Dr. Jonathan Bernstein walked out of his office at the Undiagnosed Diseases Network clinic. He made his way down the hallway and to an examination room where his newest patients were waiting. Danny and Nikki Miller had applied to the UDN clinic for help in the spring of 2016, and they were finally accepted into the program in the fall. But before they could come into the clinic for their first appointment, Dr. Bernstein had ordered an even more ambitious form of genetic testing called whole genome sequencing. And not just for the two boys. Dr. Bernstein wanted the testing for the entire family. Whole genome sequencing decodes a person's entire gene sequence, almost like breaking down the entire instruction manual to an individual person. It's the gold standard for genetic testing because it reveals every single gene, not just a portion of them. Dr. Bernstein hoped that if he could see the entire family's genetic sequence, he'd be able to spot what was going on with the boys. Now, 3 months later, the testing still was not done, but Dr. Bernstein wanted to meet his new patients in person. He walked into the exam room and immediately saw that Chase and Carson had regressed significantly since their parents first applied to the program last spring. Both Carson and Chase were strapped into their wheelchairs to keep them from slumping to the side. Dr. Bernstein suspected that neither of the boys could sit up on their own. And yet, both boys seemed to perk up when Dr. Bernstein entered the room. He said hello, and both boys gave Dr. Bernstein big smiles. It was clear to Dr. Bernstein that the boys were aware of what was going on around them. They just weren't able to verbalize. Nikki and Danny both stood to greet Dr. Bernstein and shake his hand. Then Nikki explained that over the past year, Chase and Carson had both lost almost all of their motor skills. Chase was 3 years old now, and Carson was 5, but neither boy could walk or talk. Danny chimed in, adding that at this point, they also needed assistance just to eat and drink. Dr. Bernstein began giving Carson and Chase routine physical examinations. As he did, he warned the Millers that it would still be a little while before their whole genome sequencing results were back from the lab. But when they were done, he'd have detailed genetic information for both parents and children that told the story of the entire family. But, even then, he warned, Nikki and Danny would need to be patient. It could take nearly a year for Dr. Bernstein's team to make a diagnosis. Still, Dr. Bernstein promised that if anyone was going to find an answer, it would be this clinic. Danny nodded, and Nikki told Dr. Bernstein that they were used to waiting. Finally, in February of 2018, a full 2 years after Danny first reached out to the Undiagnosed Disease Network, Dr. Bernstein called the Millers to say he had figured out what was wrong with Carson and Chase. They were suffering from one of the rarest diseases in the entire world. And the fact that both boys had the same condition was the result of almost unimaginably bad luck. Carson and Chase did in fact have a genetic defect, but one so tiny, no other genetic testing revealed any problem. Their condition was caused by a malfunction in a single gene out of the 20,000 genes needed to make a person. The defect was so hard to detect that Dr. Bernstein's team could only find it by looking at all 3 billion DNA base pairs that are the building blocks for genes. And remarkably, both Chase and Carson had inherited the same defect. The whole genome sequencing revealed that the boys' parents, Nikki and Danny, carried an incredibly rare genetic mutation. It's almost inconceivable that two people with this mutation would meet and have kids, and rarer still, that they would pass the mutation on to both of their kids. In both Carson and Chase's DNA, a small section of a gene called the MECR gene was broken, and this caused a catastrophic problem. Because the MECR gene is what allows our cells to generate the energy they need to function. If the MECR gene is broken, the cells cannot function properly. Dr. Bernstein explained that the cells most affected by a broken MECR gene are the cells at the base of the brain, which is the area responsible for movement. That's why the boys couldn't crawl or walk or move around. It's why they suffered so many developmental delays and had a lack of basic physical abilities. This condition, called mitochondrial enol-CoA reductase protein-associated neurodegeneration, or MPAN syndrome, is so rare that Carson and Chase were only the 8th and 9th patients in the world to be diagnosed with it. Danny and Nikki were relieved that doctors had finally given them a diagnosis for their kids, but it was accompanied by grim news. Dr. Bernstein told them that there was no recognized treatment for MPAN, and no proven way to help the boys regain their motor skills. But that's when Danny Miller took over. Once he received the diagnosis, Danny went back to his research, this time looking for a way to manage MPAN syndrome. And he quickly learned that patients with MPAN syndrome lack something called lipoic acid in their cells. Lipoic acid is crucial to generating power inside cells, and without it, the brain runs out of energy. At first, Danny thought that overcoming this deficiency would mean expensive treatments and therapies. But after looking into it more, he was amazed to find that he could actually buy lipoic acid supplements for only $16 a bottle online. He ordered the supplements for Carson and Chase, and after a few months of taking them, it seemed like the boys' motor function had stopped deteriorating. In fact, when Danny and Nikki took the boys to the neurologist, he told them that Carson and Chase were even showing some signs of improvement. Unfortunately, though, there is no way to fully restore their physical abilities, at least at this time. Carson and Chase still rely on wheelchairs to get around, and they both rely on computers to communicate. However, thanks to their parents' dedication, their condition seems to have stabilized. And hopefully, in the future, there will be a better treatment plan or even a cure. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop, and for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth.
He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now, being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment. But even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations, and they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry, they'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure. And so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for 2 conditions: high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first 2, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection, and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. so he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten, rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were a really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life, though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan and Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan.